Henry II, the first Plantagenet King of England, was a man of extraordinary talent, whose worst enemy was himself. Let's jump into the pages of medieval history to discover how a man who had accomplished so much, had so much power and inspired so much fear and dread, wound up betrayed and miserable. Let's go! Welcome to the channel. I'm Marchioness Darby, and I'm a major history and ancestry nerd. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm on the road toward monetization, and I'd really appreciate your help. And of course, please don't forget to share this video. Now, usually when we think of a figure who inspires us, we might think of a luminary figure such as Martin Luther King Jr., or Roberto Clemente, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, people who overcame tremendous obstacles and did good things for humanity. But can we learn from someone's bad example? Can we gain wisdom and inspiration from someone's flaws and weaknesses? After all, even the best people in the world aren't perfect, right? Take King Henry II, the first Plantagenet King of England. Henry lived in the late 12th century, a very different time to our own. But before we do a deep dive into Henry's life, let's take care of a couple of disclaimers. First of all, medieval people had very different values to many of ours today, and some things were acceptable back then that you could never get away with now. For example, girls as young as 12 getting married, punishing homosexuals with mutilation, and trial by combat or water. Furthermore, medieval society, especially during Henry's time, was far more tribal than it is now. Sure, there were kings going back centuries before Henry came along, but they had to contend with regional uprisings and rogue barons and other forces trying to conquer their land. In other words, colonialism is nothing new, and nor is dirty politics. Suffice it to say that the medieval mindset was pretty different. That being said, human nature seldom changes, as people these days are just as obsessed with power and control as they were in Henry's time. So let's get into Henry's life. Henry ascended to the English throne in 1154, after a 19-year period called the Anarchy. Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, was the last surviving legitimate child of Henry I, after her brother William tragically died in a boating accident known as the White Ship. This created an awkward situation of handing the crown to a woman, practically unthinkable back then. Sure enough, even after Henry had gotten his barons to swear fealty to Matilda, the moment he died, his nephew Stephen of Blois steamrolled his way in and usurped the throne from Matilda, who was far away when she learned of her father's death. And by the way, Stephen was one of the barons who swore fealty to Matilda. So much for loyalty, right? Matilda and those loyal to her spent the next 2 decades literally fighting for her birthright, but with no success. It was only when her teenage son Henry was finally able to wear down Stephen and get him to make Henry his heir that the anarchy finally came to an end. By then, Matilda was able to settle in Normandy and preside over the government there while Henry ruled England and their territories in France. By the way, Henry was never a king in France. France had a king, Louis VII, who ironically was also the first husband of Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Louis had divorced Eleanor when she couldn't have a son, though she didn't have that problem with Henry. In fact, she and Henry had 5 sons together. Henry also gained power over Eleanor's homeland, the Duchy of Aquitaine, meaning that Henry had more French territory than the French king. But Henry was a vassal to Louis, meaning that while he had power in these regions, he ultimately owed fealty to the French king. We'll save that for another video. But this does lead to the first problem with Henry as a leader. We've already seen Henry's early talents. Even as a young teenager, Henry was able to galvanize knights and soldiers to fight for the cause of his mother, and he was able to use a combination of political and military power to bring King Stephen essentially to his knees. That is no small accomplishment for any young man of any era. At the same time, we have to take note of Henry's obsession with power. One could argue that he learned this young, watching his own mother having to struggle so hard and losing so much, all during Henry's formative years. It makes sense that he always referred to himself not as King Henry, but as Henry Fitz-Empress, in honor of his mother's struggle. Surely that's an admirable quality to want to honor your mother and to support her in difficult times. At the same time, however, we can also see that perhaps Henry gained a sense of mission, which again is fine, but went overboard in later years. It's as though he struggled so hard as a young man to gain that power in his mother's name, and then just kept going, regardless of who he alienated in the process. Coming from a modern perspective, we expect our leaders to look out for our best interests, to help to make our lives as smooth as possible, and to keep the peace. Granted, Henry had to deal with constant uprisings from both English and French vassals, but at the same time, his constant aggression toward Louis VII only exacerbated the situation. Furthermore, Henry's attempts to exert control in Aquitaine did not land well. The people of Aquitaine had loyalty to Eleanor and her son Richard, not to Henry, and they resented his dictatorial attempts to control their lives. This highlights a major flaw in Henry's leadership style, and it's a signal to those in power. Rather than being attentive to the needs of the people, he decided to impose himself in harsh ways, without regard to the welfare of those under his rule. And even though he felt entitled to do this, as a medieval ruler, doesn't make it an excuse. In fact, by showing goodwill toward the people of Aquitaine, Henry could have gained their loyalty, but instead, his tyranny earned them their wrath and resentment. Now let's take a look at Henry's clash with the Catholic Church. This gets complicated because the medieval church was still wrapped up in geopolitics and the Crusades and many other situations. Due to a tradition dating back to the ancient world, Henry had some say in who could be appointed as bishop in England. In those days, too, the church was the greatest landowner in England, and back then, land was power. Kings like Henry, therefore, wanted to assert as much power over the church as possible. One of the good things that Henry did was to enact legal reforms throughout England, setting the stage for English common law. His vision was to ensure that justice was equal for all people, at least by medieval standards. The problem was that the church, or the ecclesial court, had jurisdiction over clergy. That meant that even if a priest or a canon committed murder, the civil courts couldn't touch him. Henry was rightly concerned that the ecclesial courts were often more lenient on misbehaving priests, thus interfering with what Henry wanted for the whole land. This brought him into direct conflict with Thomas Becket. He and Thomas had been friends, and Thomas served him as Lord Chancellor. Henry wanted Thomas to become Archbishop of Canterbury with the hopes of using his friend to get rid of the benefit of clergy. So Henry was infuriated when Thomas doubled down on the practice, rather than letting Henry manipulate him to get his way. The fight turned lethal a few years later, and when an enraged Henry told his knights, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" or something to the effect. Whatever Henry exactly said, his statement caused 4 of Henry's knights to go to Canterbury Cathedral, where they murdered Thomas, likely to prove their fealty to Henry. Thomas Becket's murder sparked outrage across Europe, and also within Henry's family. Realizing how badly he had messed up, Henry tried to throw his own knights under the bus, saying he didn't mean for them to actually kill the guy. But no one was buying this excuse, in particular members of his own family. Yet it took Henry 4 full years to do any sort of public penance, mainly after 3 of his own sons were rebelling against his rule. What it comes down to is this. When you blend the personal with the professional, your judgments are going to be tainted because you're acting from your own interest, and don't necessarily have the welfare of others in mind. Henry dismissed Eleanor's attachment to Aquitaine and its people, making the situation needlessly complicated. Furthermore, when you make major decisions in anger, you blind yourself to the reality of what is going on around you, and to the actual intentions of those who oppose you. Henry had good reason to be frustrated with Thomas, but the way he handled the situation didn't work out for anyone. What did it bring but violence, death, resentment, and rebellion? As the resentment you therefore cause starts to build up, you put your own safety at risk, as well as the security of those under you. Especially in medieval times, these kinds of resentments almost always resulted in war, insurrection, and violence. Now let's take a look at Henry as a family man. Again, we're talking about medieval royalty, so it's not like he's going to be the typical dad coming home from the office every day. In fact, it was typical for royal children to be raised first by a wet nurse, and if they lived to the age of 7, they were sent to live in another royal or noble household. Boys would be educated and learn to become knights, while girls learned how to be wives and mothers, though some royal girls did receive a little education. This is not unlike some moderate upper-class families who let their children be raised by nannies, personal assistants, and boarding schools. Royal mothers such as Eleanor did have some political influence and would often serve as regent, such as when her son was too young or her husband out of the country. Henry's own mother, Matilda, took on this role for him in Normandy after he became King of England, while Eleanor acted as authority in Aquitaine, her homeland. This is where Henry had another problem. While he honored his own mother's legacy when he was a young man, he did not approach the lands he had acquired from his wife with the same respect. He did give Richard a little authority in Aquitaine, mainly because of Eleanor. She had tired of his domineering personality and had moved to Poitiers to get away from him, taking Richard with her. Where the people of Aquitaine resented Henry, they loved Eleanor and Richard, who had done many great things for them. One problem Henry faced was related to his youngest son, John. As the youngest of 5 boys, Henry hadn't planned on giving any land to him, figuring that he would either marry another royal and gain land from her family, or that he would enter religious life. Henry had already split his lands up among his older surviving sons, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, William, and Richard, so there was nothing left for John. But when William died unexpectedly, Henry realized that John might need land after all, so he started chipping away at the lands given to the other brothers, causing them and Eleanor to rebel openly against Henry. In fact, they even united with the French king, Eleanor's ex, to militate against Henry, causing Eleanor ultimately to be imprisoned by her own husband for the rest of his life. Henry's mismanagement of his lands over time caused the Plantagenet dynasty to lose control of nearly every holding in France by the death of John. But it wasn't just the mismanagement of land that created this problem. Sure, Henry's sons were trained to be knights, but not to be kings. Henry the young king was particularly frustrated with this. He had been crowned as co-king in 1170, but his father never gave him any real authority. Sure, young Henry was popular and capable, and he was a bit of a star athlete in those days, but he never felt like his father had any confidence in his abilities. One can wonder whether young Henry felt a bit used. It's as though his father liked the idea of a co-king, but was too jealous of his own power to actually share authority with his son. And if young Henry wasn't trained to be king, neither was John. John was superbly educated. He was literate, athletic, and an excellent chess player. But as the youngest boy, with several older brothers and a power-hungry father, John was never considered as a future king, and simply wasn't brought up that way. Therefore, when he did become king after Richard was assassinated in 1199, John was a complete disaster. Not only had he lost nearly all Plantagenet lands in France, but his own barons rose up against him, forcing him to sign Magna Carta in 1216. These barons perhaps could see what Henry could not, that when one has tremendous power, he is obligated to use that power wisely. But John's upbringing prevented him from doing that. What it comes down to is that when you spoil a child, you're setting them up for failure later in life, which is exactly what happened to John. Now let's contrast Henry with King Louis IX of France, who ruled during the time of Henry III, Henry's grandson by John. And by the way, Henry III was nearly as bad a king as his father. Louis, a canonized Catholic saint, became king at age 12, so his mother, Blanche of Castile, served as regent for him until he reached his majority, and she made sure her son grew up with strong religious principles. In modern times, we surely would have serious problems with how Louis treated French Jews of the time, along with the very harsh punishments given to blasphemers. Now, we can't excuse this or be dismissive of this, but we also have to look at this from the context of the times, and thankfully these behaviors have long ceased to be acceptable. That being said, Louis did create a justice system where people could appeal directly to him. He also got rid of the brutal practice of trial by combat, a practice that Henry approved of. Louis also spent much time as a crusader, as Richard did, and in fact was imprisoned in Egypt for a time. But unlike Henry, Louis didn't allow family spats to get in the way of how he ruled. In fact, when Louis clashed with Henry III, it was in support of his own brother, Alphonse of Poitiers. Hugh de Lusignan, an ally of Henry III, had lands in Aquitaine, which was firmly under Capetian control by then. So when Hugh began to militate against Alphonse, his brother, King Louis, stepped in to defend lands he already possessed. In fact, this battle against Henry and his Lusignan allies brought the end of Plantagenet control over any part of France, and with few losses to his own troops. Louis was also able to get a peace treaty with Henry in 1259. What this really shows is that Henry II created a legacy of mismanagement and weakness among his descendants, which could have been avoided had he ruled from his head and shown his family any sense of regard or trust. Even if you're a king or someone with tremendous political or economic power, your children still need guidance and direction from you. Failure to do this can result in kids who become entitled, ungrateful, resentful, and untrustworthy. When you make empty promises to a child, as Henry did to his son, you create an atmosphere of mistrust. And if a child can't rely on their parents' words, you're setting them up for instability. If they can't trust their own parents, who can they trust? So what's the ultimate lesson we can learn from Henry II? I think there are three main things. First, no matter what power you possess, it should be wielded with the virtues of honesty, empathy, and generosity. Power should be used to create peace and prosperity for as many as possible, rather than to get revenge or to create division and anger. Second, as a partner, you need to treat them with respect and consideration. Henry's disrespect of Eleanor's concerns and his reckless use of the land he only possessed because of her led her to militate against him. Had he learned from her how to approach the people of Aquitaine, perhaps things would have gone better for everyone. Finally, as a parent, you have a responsibility to develop your children into balanced, stable, healthy adults. That means being honest with your children. And even if you're a king or a CEO, you still need to provide them with the skills they'll need to continue your legacy, or at the very least, to function successfully in the world on their own. So that's it for this video. Please don't forget to give this a like, and of course, please subscribe to this channel and click on the notification bell for future videos. Also, feel free to leave a comment below. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!